European pagan cultures or other esoteric systems like Hermeticism. I think again it's not that one has physically influenced the other, they come from the same root source, which is the human condition. Taoism also believes in peace. It is essentially a non-violent philosophy, and the sage, if confronted with turmoil and trouble and lies and deceit, retires into the forests or often up to the mountain tops. And Taoist temples were often on the tops of mountains, where you're safe from the kind of squabbling madness of city-urban factionism. So I'd love it to be better known. I think if there were Taoist classes in Palestine and Israel going on, if that was part of the religious education of the children of both cultures and nations, we probably wouldn't have all these conflicts. I know that in Israel it is studied, and there are scholars in Israel who know about these things. Not enough of them. I have friends who are interested in this and study it, and also Tai Chi is quite a common a series of movements that are practiced which are connected with Taoism, because they believe that the body has these energies, or lines of Qi, and the meridians are energy lines for Qi, which is the ultimate energy behind the universe, which have to flow in the body for health. And so, you know, there's great wisdom there. I wish it was studied more and taught more. Yes. Okay, that's that one. Let's move on to the next one. So then we have Islam. So we're coming to Arabia and we're moving forward in time over 1,000 years from Lao Tzu to Muhammad. And then to Wahhabism, it's much more recent. It's like the 1750s when Ibn al-Wahhab was alive, who was a particular religious leader in the Arabian Peninsula, who was very strict in his interpretation of Islam. He was a Sunni Muslim, and he was very, I think, limited in his educational background. I've studied his life story and his education. He was a very strict literalist. He believed the Quran should be read literally and interpreted it as an absolute. But the trouble with that kind of Islam is that it's, I think, very restrictive. He was very scathing against other forms of Islam which were more liberal and which were more mystical. He didn't have any time for that, no. He seemed to believe in a very literalist God. And in his worldview, that God was quite unforgiving and was going to punish everyone that wasn't a strict, literalist type of Muslim. And he read the Quranic verses that say they're going to go to the fire, literally. He believed that that they will one day be consumed in God's last judgment, in a punishment, like a hellfire will be wreaked on them all. And the only people that survive are Wahhabi Muslims who follow his strict interpretations of Islam. Now I find that all rather dangerous and rather disturbing. And that's why I spent 10 years doing a commentary on the Quran for all my Muslim friends. I have Muslims who are Shias and Sunnis and Sufis and Ismailis. I've met Muslims from all different categories and varieties. I think it's time we had this conversation within the Islamic community and within the world community. We can't afford for that kind of very narrow-minded literalism to get away with dominating the headlines, because it's a false teaching. And you also get it in Christianity. You get it with evangelical, so-called pseudo-evangelical Christians who preach the same kind of hell and damnation stuff. You also get it in certain forms of Judaism. And you got it most vehemently, it appears, in the settler movement, who are the most virulently hateful against the Palestinians, and who, in the same way, they believe in a very narrow, literal kind of Judaism. You can read the Jewish Bible in a most horrendous mandate to slaughter and kill anyone that isn't on God's team. And unfortunately, both Christian, Jewish and Islamic fundamentalism like that is very dangerous, in my opinion, as a philosopher, and needs intellectually unpicking. It's like a knot that's developed. Now, that lineage of Wahhabi Islam has been influential behind the scenes in forming the minds of some Islamic terrorist factions, and some of the Islamic extremists, like ISIS, and other groups, and to some extent the circle around Osama bin Laden, although there are some questions about that. To what extent they were actually Wahhabis is a matter of research, because as far as I can tell, Osama bin Laden was more intelligent than that. But it certainly shaped the Saudi Arabian government in its religious policies, because Ibn Wahhab was friends with the founders of the Saudi monarchy. And what they did is they captured, through a series of military battles against the Turks, who were ruling Arabia at the time as the Great Ottoman Empire, these Arab religious extremists associated with Ibn Wahhab did a deal with a military potentate. We'll back you in your bid to be the monarch of this part of Saudi Arabia if you will then implement our religious policies. And a deal was struck. So they did capture control of Mecca and Medina and Riyadh, which became their capital. But then they implemented extremely strict religious policies. To give you one example, in Wahhabi Islam, if a woman is convicted of adultery, or even just accused of it, by her husband and a couple of other male witnesses, she can be stoned to death. Indeed, she has to be stoned to death. It's not can be. She is guilty. She must be stoned to death. And that is the punishment inflicted by Wahhabi Islam. And there are several instances when Ibn Wahhab himself picked up the stone and carried out the sentence along with a group of others, because this is God's ruling, and he believed that the God that he followed demanded that. Well, I don't agree with that kind of reading of the Quran. I don't believe that true Islam is about that. To me, true Islam is about surrender of the soul to the absolute, whereas this kind of Wahhabi Islam is about egotistical claiming to be the best surrenderer to the best absolute, and that all the others are, heresies. So anyway, it's caused a lot of trouble, Wahhabi Islam, and it still is doing, and it is not, I think, is not intellectually justifiable. And as a philosopher, I'd be very happy to engage in debates with Wahhabi intellectuals, and there are some. But to me, it's a false teaching, and I believe the European intellectual tradition, which I represent, has already kind of critiqued this sufficiently, and that's why we have freedom of speech in Europe. We have freedom of religion. We believe in genuine tolerance. And we believe in intellectual debate instead of stoning people. And on matters of sexuality, we have a certain liberal attitude and don't believe that God wants sort of violent punishment against people. Rather, we should find how to navigate emotionality and sexuality in a loving way. And don't forget, it was Christ who, I think, on that particular point, got it right with the woman taken in adultery, and she was brought before Jesus and said, they were trying to trick him, they said, well, she's supposed to be stoned to death, what do you say, you're a rabbi? And he looked at them, he'd been drawing on the ground, it's a beautiful passage this in St. John's Gospel, and he looked up from the ground, he said, okay, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. and they all melted away one by one, because his point was that we all make mistakes. Maybe we don't all commit adultery, but we all do things that, we would probably regret. So how should it be for us to stone somebody to death who may have just fallen in love with somebody without the proper guidance and whatever? So the law of compassion that Christ was teaching from, it seems to me Ibn Wahhab didn't read that. And one of the things I lament is the fact that religious education in the Islamic world needs uplifting. It needs upscaling. And that's why I've done the periodic table, one of the many reasons. I'd love this to be on the wall of every seminary in the Christian world, and also the Jewish world and the Islamic world. I used to teach at the Muslim college with very advanced Islamic students who by right should have access to all this, because true Islam, and there's another box for Islam, philosophical Islam, which is the kind I believe in, of Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina and the great intellectuals of Islamic tradition. They would never have said stone people to death for making the odd mistake. And they would say, no, wisdom is our entitlement. And true Islam, if you're going to surrender to the absolute, you have to know what the absolute is in order to surrender. And that requires knowledge. You have to be a person of ilm, knowledge, to find how to surrender, because if without knowledge you don't know how to do it. And the Quran is a tremendous guide for that. Superb. Everybody should read it, and you should listen to my commentary on it, because I think I've opened the gates to the Quran for everyone that's not a Muslim, as well as everyone who is a Muslim on the planet. But you should also read the Taoist scripture, because that opens the gates to incredible wisdom in China, or the Zen Buddhist scriptures, and the Yogacara Buddhist teachings about consciousness only. We had one of the founders of Yogacara Buddhism today in prayers. You should read the scriptures of all 168 boxes, the Platonic tradition, Aristotle. That's, to me, true Islam is to surrender to the wisdom of them all and the wisdom behind them all. So, anyway, there's some thoughts on how these two things correlate. I hope that's useful. Any questions about those two? I mean, obviously one could do more detail, but we don't have time to go into enormous depth. Okay, well, let's move on then. And let's come at this from another perspective, which is the tarot of the gods. So what I've done with this tarot is, I love the tarot. I have done ever since, I was a teenager and just first discovered them in Brighton back in the 70s. They're fascinating, and there are lots of tarots of the goddesses. It's quite a common thing you can find in, alternative shops from Glastonbury to San Francisco to Paris and so on. But this is the first ever one for the masculine male gods. And I think one of the other things about Ibn Wahhab and Islam is it's quite masculist, and men are they like to fight. It's just in our genes, it seems. And so the deities of the males are sometimes they're quite warlike and quite aggressive. It's true in the Hebrew Bible, Yahweh seems to be a warrior god in many parts and many passages where he's smiting the enemy because they're not proper, they're not his followers. And when Netanyahu invoked the smiting of Amalek, this is the enemy of Israel, well, God leads them into battle and they kill them en masse. So we've got a lot of male gods being misused around the planet to justify war crimes and violence. How about really understanding what male deities are? How about really looking into it and finding the depths behind that? Mars wasn't originally a Roman god of war. He was a god of fertility and farming in the very earliest levels of Roman civilization. So in the Celtic world, when I lived in the Slad Valley near Stroud, I discovered that archaeologists had found a sculpture thing of Mars as a farming deity, because the Celts liked farming and they liked peace eventually, when the Druids managed to talk them into it. And so they had realised Mars was a fertility farming god, not a war god. But, so anyway, that's why I've done the Tarot of the Gods, and let's see if two that we draw on today will throw further light on our planetary existential dilemmas that we're facing. Right. Okay. Thank you. Right. Okay. Well, these are two interesting ones. So first we've got the Ten of Fire, which is the god Bel, a Celtic druid god, and he's the origin of the term Beltane. And which is a time in May when one celebrates the return of warmth and heat. And Beltane is a time when couples like to dance over a fire and get married in the Celtic hand-fasting tradition. There's a picture of a couple dancing around the flames and jumping over the fire. So he was a solar god, and in this cold, dark time of year, I think we realise how much we love the sun, because we really need the sun in the daytime. When it's sunny, it warms the place up a bit. It's been really quite cold here. So the Celtic Belgic cult venerated the solar god Belinos, which was his name in Europe, as receiver of the dead and lord of the otherworld. He was equated to Apollo. Belinos promoted growth and decay, as the sun does. And he was worshipped also in Ireland and Wales and throughout Europe. He was the patron deity of the Italian city of Aquileia, and was often associated with the horse. There's a clay horse figurine found at a Belinos shrine, Sainte Sabine in Burgundy in France. He's also associated with the wheel, because it was the Celts actually that first really developed the wheel for long distance chariots, and they certainly were the first to put iron tyres on wood to make like long distance carts possible going across Europe on the roads. There's a shrine to Belinos in Bordeaux, here in Gaul. There are 51 known inscriptions dedicated to Belinos in Gaul, but evidence has been found more widely throughout the Celtic world as well. So he was accompanied by a female, his consort Belisama, and she was, the Celts were fond of their dancing together. This is a couple. So Bel had his female consort as well. There's some speculation that Bel might come from a root in Indo-European meaning to shine, and may be related to the word Apollo. So Pel, and Bel might go back to the same root. If Bel was ancestrally linked to Apollo, it would explain quite a few things. Then there's also speculation, is he connected to Baal, the Phoenician deity we had last week? Again, it's possible. And I talk about this in the text. I go into it. One of the epithets of Belinus was Vindonus, and the town or city of Vienna is named after Bel as Vindona. It was originally called Vindobona, and it was a Celtic town, Vienna, along the Danube, like many other great cities like Paris and London. They were all founded by Celtic pioneers, and Druid geomancers would have laid them out. The same is true of Milan, because northern Italy was Celtic, and also other like Bologna was a Celtic city, and perhaps Bologna is connected to Bel. So the Druids loved him, and they were devoted to peace. I mean, you couldn't be a Druid and kind of do war crimes. You'd be thrown out of the Druid order. They were like Jains. They were dedicated to personal non-violence, and they had the intellectual authority over the Celtic tribes throughout Europe. They commissioned warriors from time to time to take action, but only if all other means had been exhausted. I don't believe that on the matter of Israel-Palestine, all means of mediation and peacemaking have been exhausted or tried. I've tried with my Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East to get dialogue going, but the official parties, both the Israeli and the Palestinians, have been very resistant to actual dialogue. I think what we need is preventative diplomacy for peace, and I'm sure that's what Bel and his Druid, European priests and intellectuals would have asked for. And I think it's true also in the Ukraine-Russian situation. I think only intellectual diplomacy and genuine peace diplomacy can solve these problems. And so I appeal to the Russian people and the Israeli and Ukrainian and Palestinian people, to come to the party of peacemaking. There's another form of the god's name, Abellio, which has been found again throughout Gaul. And it's interesting, he's the god of apple trees. Abellio was associated with apple groves in different parts of Gaul. And if you cut an apple, you get a 5-pointed star. It was seen as a very sacred thing, a fruit of Bel. He also had a healing quality. So the cult of Belinos often was identified as a healing sanctuary. So Temple of Bel would have like in Greek temples to Asclepius, there was a healing place where you could go and stay overnight. And don't forget that Apollo is the god of healing in Greek religion. So is it possible that it seems to me yet more evidence that there's a link between Bel or Belinus and Apollo, going right back to pre-writing times. There's a municipality in Aquileia in Italy which is still called Beligna. Interestingly, one of the great tribal leaders of Britain, pre-Roman, was called Cunobelinos, which means the hound of Belinos. Cymbeline is how he's described by Shakespeare. And it was part of the folklore or historical traditions of the ancient British to remember Bel in that way. Okay, so I think what we can learn from this is that we need healing, and we need peace, and we need that solar light to dispel the fogs of illusion and chaos. And violence begins in the mind, thought. In the Yogacara tradition of Buddhism that I was talking about, they believe there are 8 forms of consciousness, and I've been studying this today and writing about it. There are 8 levels of consciousness. They include the 5 senses, like the consciousness of hearing, of seeing, of the body consciousness of touch, physicality. And then there's sort of what we call common sense in the mind. And then there's a form of mind that becomes confused and chaotic and over-polarised and over-anxious, a sort of worried mind, impure, constantly festering away with thoughts that don't go anywhere. That's the seventh form of consciousness. And then the eighth form of consciousness is the collective consciousness, what's called the alaya vijnana, which is the realm of archetypes, what Jung called the collective unconscious. Okay, so those 8 forms of consciousness are what we are. And in Zen Buddhism, they say we have to transmute those 8 forms of consciousness into 4 types of wisdom. We have to work on purifying those 8 forms of consciousness, so that we can transmute them into types of wisdom. And it's really interesting, if you look at Zen Buddhism, they were inspired. Zen Buddhism was brought to Japan by people who'd studied in China this Yogacara tradition of these 8 forms of consciousness. And I think, the tools are there in things like mindfulness training and so on, which I was doing just recently in Bournemouth with a colleague who's trained in that. I think that's that purification consciousness, so that we act as recipients of that solar wisdom of Bel, in the healing sense of light, or Apollo, is what will get us through this as a planet. And that's working with all the traditions from the periodic table, not just selectively saying, well, that's my one, I'm sticking with that, and to hell with all the others, I'm going to blow them up. That's Putin. That's saying, no, my form of Russian Orthodoxy, that's the best one. The Russian Orthodox priesthoods of Russia refused to sign my interfaith peace treaty in a most arrogant way, saying, no, only Russian Orthodoxy is true. They wouldn't even accept other forms of Christianity, like Protestants or Catholics. No, only Russian Orthodoxy is true, so we're not signing that. Well, okay, that's exactly what the Wahhabis say within Islam. Only ours is true, all the others are heretics. That's what's got to go if we're going to get through this. And from a Yogacara perspective, that means purifying that 7th type of consciousness. Where that comes from, that's anxiety, fear, and it's a mistaken egotism, thinking I am identified with that, whichever box it is. I am a Wahhabi, I am a Russian Orthodox Christian, I am an Anglican, whatever. No, ultimately we're all made from one divine collective mind, which is what is behind the whole show, is what, and the Buddhist one up here, the Mahayana tradition, is what I'm talking about. So we have to get collective enlightenment. Okay, so that's Bel. We love him. As a Druid, obviously, I'm sworn to his, path of wisdom. But that doesn't mean I don't follow all the others too. Follow them all, because it all comes from the one light, right? Now we've got our last one, Earth, 3 of Earth, which is Saturn. And the 3 of Earth, or Saturn, or Kronos in Latin, or Greek rather. Saturn was the Roman deity and Kronos was the Greek version. We've had him before, but I think we'll have him again because he is relevant to this. It's interesting who actually Saturn is as a deity, because in the Roman religion he actually is quite a nice deity. He was the god of the Golden Age, before Jupiter took over. Saturn and his wife, Ops, who I have a special fondness for, were the gods and goddesses of the Golden Age. And that's why he's shown with a scythe and surrounded by apples and fruit, because it was a time of paradise, sort of Garden of Eden times. And his wife, Ops, is looking very attractive, and they're in a garden. I watched a film recently about Italian nature and how sort of succulent it is in different parts of Italy, and how it's very fecund. Well, that's Saturn. Now, what's interesting, when the Roman religious scholars came across Judaism, and don't forget there was a tremendous war between Rome and Israel, the Jewish wars written about by Josephus. Rome didn't know what to make of the Jewish religion. They couldn't understand it, because what is this one God thing? how can you just have one God? There are so many. It just couldn't relate to it. And it seemed to them a sort of primitive barbarism. And then someone hit on a good explanation, which is they said, well, no, the Jews actually worship Saturn, the original god. And that's why they're so stubborn in their worship. And as proof, they discovered that the mount on which the Jewish people, on which Saturn came, was called Mount Ida in Crete, where he's supposed to have been born as Kronos. And they did this etymological thing, saying that's why the Judaeus, the Jews, came from Saturn. They come from that name. So there was a link between Ida and Crete and Judaeus, the Jewish people, in the minds of these Roman scholars. And they also said that's why, because Saturn is associated with the inability to budge, inflexibility, sort of, a refusal to be other than inflexible. And the Romans said that's the problem with the Jews. That's why they fought them so fiercely. And, it was a horrendous war, which Josephus, the historian of the time, who initially was a Jewish general, he went over to the Roman side when he realised the Roman army couldn't be defeated. He then jumped ship and joined the Romans, not as a general but as an intellectual, and he befriended Vespasian, who was leading the army against the Jews. And then he went to Rome, and he became friends with Titus, who succeeded Vespasian as the emperor. So Saturn, what I would say, and this is interesting, this bit. Let's suspend judgment. Is that possibly true that the Yahweh school of Judaism was influenced in a sense by the Golden Age followers of Kronos? It certainly fits with the Garden of Eden story that deep down the Jewish people are yearning for a golden age of paradise. They want to get back to the garden of happiness. They want themselves, but actually all mankind, to get back to the garden. They lament the fact that we fell from paradise, seduced by Satan, and have been wandering ever since, in suffering. And so Judaism wants to get back to paradise, and in a sense that's what Zionism is trying to do, is trying to get actually all mankind back to paradise, because they believe that if the Jews can get back to paradise, have their promised land back, plant it and grow lots of fruits and apples, then the whole of humanity will get back to paradise. That's what certain visionary Zionists believe. And that's why they were doing it. And I'm saying that's part of this yearning towards the Saturn age of the promised land that we've all lost. And that's why they're so fiercely holding on to that dream. Discuss, a friend of my mother's called Jacqueline Rose, who's a Jewish historian and academic and philosopher and psychoanalyst, has written a very good book on Zionism. And she discusses this messianic idea in Zionism, that by getting back to Zion, i.e. this sacred land, it will get all humanity back to paradise. That was the project of Zionism. The trouble is, of course, it hasn't quite worked out like that. And there was no real thinking through this, because what about the people that already lived there, most of whom were either Christian or Muslim? What about, and what I call for is sort of a collaborative meta-Zionism, whereby we all get back to our promised lands in peace.